Yeah, thanks, guys. We're going to continue on with our series called The Way today, and we're talking about becoming people of the tower. There's a saying I quite like, which is that inspiration gets you to the starting line, but it's habit that gets you to the finish line. And I think that's especially true when we apply it to our faith journey. See, it's easy to get inspired. You go to a concert and you get G'd up and you come back and you've got a little bit of an adrenaline rush. But maintaining that and living the Jesus way day to day becomes much more challenging. And really what we're doing in Lent is taking a stock take of how we're going. Are we living the Jesus way? Are we living with discipline, or are we living by inspiration? Are we practicing the way that Jesus lived as his disciples, as his followers? Or are we not? Like I said, this week we're going to look at the tower in particular. You'll find the story in John 13. I'm going to it'll be up on the screen, but it's reasonably long, so if you've got a phone, the Bible on it or whatever, go for it. It won't blame you and say that you're on Facebook or whatever. The story goes like this. It was just before Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realise now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you, for he knew who was going to betray him." And that's why he said not everyone was clean. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them." There's a bunch going on in this story, and we're just sort of going to skate over some of it today. Scholars, you might remember from the message we did on John's Gospel last year, that scholars divide John's Gospel into 4 parts. There's the prologue, which is most of the first chapter, or the first 20 verses. Then we move into the book of signs, which takes up the next 12 chapters. The book of glory comes after that, and then there's the epilogue, which is the scene post-resurrection on the beach. You can tell, this story takes place at the beginning of the book of glory. So the way John writes his gospel, the first 12 chapters cover about 3 years of Jesus' ministry. The next 7 chapters cover about 48 hours. It's just the way he structured the story. But this story takes place at the beginning of the book of glory. The drama of Jesus' life and ministry is starting to come to a head. And Jesus knows what is coming and is prepared for it. And is trying to prepare his followers as the shadow of the cross begins to loom large. You can tell from the text that Jesus' behaviour made the disciples deeply uncomfortable. We tend to read this scripture as a lovely act of kindness, something where Jesus is just being nice or setting a good example. But in reality, what's going on here is that Jesus is turning the entire social structure upside down. He's committing a massive cultural no-no. And it's shocking to his disciples, and it's shocking to those that read it. Because part of the reason it was so shocking is that the hierarchy of the Roman world was very, very clear. Right? You had the emperor at the top of the tree, followed by his family, they were just underneath. Then you had the wealthy and the government officials, they were just under them. Underneath them was the working class, those were people who owned their own homes. Under the working class were the paid servants who would work in those households but had somewhere else to stay. And then finally, at the lowest end of the social spectrum, at the lowest end of that strata, were the slaves who would work in homes but not be paid. They would be on subsistence, handouts and things like that of food. And the culture was such within this social structure that you always deferred to those of higher status than you. So if a wealthy person was coming to a working person's home, the working person would bend over backwards to make sure that the rich person was comfortable. However, there were some things that the working person wouldn't do. The homeowner would never wash the rich person's feet because it was beneath their station. What would tend to happen is either a bottle would be put out so you could wash your own feet, or a slave would be ordered to wash the rich person's feet. In Jewish society, the rules were kind of similar. So Jewish servants couldn't be forced to wash their master's feet. It was a task reserved for the lowest of Gentile slaves. You did get moments or occasions where sometimes a child would wash a parent's feet, or a wife would wash the feet of her husband, or occasionally a friend would wash a friend's feet. But these were displays of extreme affection. Because washing someone's feet was a job that no one really wanted to do, and you only did it if you had to do it, or you really wanted to do it, to express something. So for Jesus to pick up a towel and a bowl of water and go from foot to foot, it wasn't a nice act. It was confronting. It was shocking. This was an action of radical humility from Jesus, especially given his status as a rabbi. See, rabbis in that culture were revered. There was a mystique about them. So when they came to your home, it was expected that you would honour them and you would serve them. That was the cultural norm. What we see in this story is a whole lot of stuff that doesn't fit within that culture. So the fact that it's during the meal that Jesus gets up and washed feet, this is supposed to be done before the meal when someone walks into your house. Secondly, the disciples really should have been falling over each other trying to wash Jesus' feet. But it never seems to enter their minds to serve the rabbi. Apparently they were all waiting for someone to serve them. Now, I've been thinking about it all week, trying to think about how to appropriately draw a parallel for our culture with Jesus' actions. And it's hard, because there's not really an action in our culture that would be of similar shocking value. The nearest I can get to is if you have someone come to visit and you follow them to the toilet and offer to help. It's that kind of shocking, confronting behaviour. It's crossing a personal boundary. Maybe a little bit easier for you to accept might be you have them come over for dinner and you feed them, and then you follow them to the bathroom and they stand there like this and you do their tea for them like they're free. That's about what it was like. And that instant reaction where we go, oh, I don't know, that was going on for the disciples while Jesus is doing this. Part of the reason for this cultural taboo is that back then feet were disgusting. You think about it, you're walking around and you're essentially walking around in thongs or open-toed sandals. No socks, no covered shoes, dirt roads. There's no working sewer system. So the sewer just sort of works down the sides of the road. It was all dumped in the street. You add to that the waste from the animals that are walking around and things like that. And now you're starting to get a sense of how rotten people's feet can be. And you can understand why washing someone else's feet was something you only did when you really had to do it, or you really wanted to do it. Now hopefully that's starting to give you a sense of the discomfort that the disciples are feeling. They would be glancing at each other while Jesus is doing this. They'd be trying to find a way out of a room that is unobtrusive, that lets them avoid this discomfort. Or failing that, they'd probably glance, looking around desperately, hoping that the floor would open up and swallow them before Jesus gets to them. It's not something that they would embrace willingly. But the thing is, in this radical act of humility, Jesus sets the tone for the church that shook the world. See, the church has always been at its best when it follows Jesus' example. We don't do power well. We never have. But my goodness, we do service well. The church has always been at its best when it's serving like Jesus. And Jesus, in this radical humility, sets an example for us to follow. One of the questions that may be worth rolling around as we move through Lent is, who and how do you need to serve, even if it upends cultural norms? What would that look like? It's a question that the more you think about it, the more awkward it gets. I think part of the reason it gets so awkward is because it forces us to confront an awful truth. That life is not really about us. So much of what we do in church, at work, in our time off, with our families, is about us. Fulfilling our comfort, getting our needs met, fulfilling our wants. But when we make that decision to follow the way of Jesus, to walk the way of Jesus, we move the needle on what's important in our lives. Because it really becomes about bringing glory to the Father, about honouring Him and Him alone, about laying down our social structures in His service. See, when we pick up Jesus' towel, when we make a decision to become people of the towel, we're called to embrace an uncomfortable humility. I think something else I see in this story that's helpful is, or I see in Jesus in this story, is that He was certain about who He was. The interplay between Jesus and the disciples, I think, is really interesting. This story, we're not sure. There are some scholars that actually say this is like, this story takes place on Passover Eve. Well, it's not the Last Supper. And the reason they say that is because we don't see them taking communion at this point and some of that sort of stuff. So it's possible it wasn't just the 12 disciples here at this meal. It might have been more than that. We're just not sure. But in among the crowd there that night, in among the guests at this dinner, was Judas. He was reclining at the table. And Jesus knew by this stage, John says it, that Judas would betray him. Well, what does Jesus do? He washes his groggy, manky feet anyway. Jesus knew that this guy was going to get up from the table, he was going to go out, and he was going to put Jesus in a world of pain. And yet Jesus took those cracked feet with all that stuff on them, and he washed them. He made a conscious decision to serve his enemy, even in that moment. It's phenomenal. But it wasn't just enemies at the table. There were friends there who were fallible, who were going to let Jesus down as well. Peter is there. He's reclining at the table. The very same Peter who would deny ever knowing Jesus. Again, Jesus knew that. And yet he washed Peter's feet. How could he do that? How could he serve these people with no agenda? Well, I think we find the answer in verse 3. It says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he'd come from God and was returning to God. What that tells us is Jesus knew who he really was. He knew where he came from, he knew where he was going, and he knew who his power resided in. Jesus was settled in terms of his identity. And he knew deep down, he knew his value didn't come from the task he performed, but from the God he knew. It's interesting, after the wilderness, where's Andrew? Oh, there he is. We talked a little bit about this last week. One of the things about disability is it has this way of teaching you that you're is not found in your functionality. And that's not just applied to people with disability. It applies to old people. It applies to kids. It applies to middle ages. Your value is not found in your functionality. That crosses into everything we do. You're not a toilet cleaner, you're a child of God who cleans toilets. You're not a teacher, you're a child of God who teaches. You design, you change dirty nappies, you babysit grandkids, you sweep floors, you construct, you cook, you clean up after your messy husband. But first and foremost, you are a child of God. Whatever you do, try and remember your value is not found in your functionality. Your value is found in your relationship to the God who made you and called you and knows you and saves you. And Jesus shows us in this story that when we know our value, we can perform our calling without an agenda. See, if you know who you are, like deep down, if you know who you are, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. I think there's a point where I'd say the big win from today would be if we can settle internally who we really are. Because then we can begin to be aware of every person that Christ puts in our path, and we can seek to serve them, to pick up the tab. And we can do it without pushing an agenda, because we know who we are, and where our worth is found. And we know who we're serving, and who is really in charge. Something else I see in this story is you can't give what you don't have. It's interesting watching Jesus interact with Peter. Basically, the story goes, they're in the meal, Jesus takes off his outer garment, which is an interesting word played by John. But then after that, he pours water into a basin and he begins to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel which wrapped around him. And he gets to Simon Peter, who says to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replies, you don't realise what I'm doing, but later you'll understand. No, says Peter, you'll never wash my feet. Jesus answers, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. I would love to know. There's a part of me, I would love to have a chat with Peter about this. Like how he viewed this exchange as he looked back on his time with Jesus. Because I reckon this was a deeply healing experience for Peter. I think it took a while for the lesson to kind of sink down and the cogs to kind of click into gear. But I think this was a healing experience for Peter. You think about Peter's background. He'd been a fisherman for years. He was self-sufficient. He was brash. He relied on bluster to get through. And suddenly, he's in the position where he's having to learn to receive in ways that are making him deeply uncomfortable. He's in a position where he's having to allow the rabbi, Jesus, to serve him. And Peter's first instinct is to recoil from him. Now, here's the rub. See what I'm doing? Washing feet. Here's the rub. Unless we allow Jesus to radically serve us, we will never be able to humbly serve and lead others. Unless we allow Jesus to radically serve us, we will never be able to humbly serve and lead others. And that radical service from Jesus, that can be a hard thing to receive in the moment, because often it takes place at our point of deepest need or deepest discomfort. For Peter, it was too much. Initially it was too much, and he goes, no way, I can't do that. It's too confronting. It's too humbling. And I think we do the same things from time to time. We feel God getting closer to our greatest area of vulnerability, and we recoil. We try to protect that thing, that bit of guilt or that bit of shame or that hurt that we've been holding on to. We kind of feel Jesus getting close and we go, no, I can't do that. No. Because letting Jesus into our point of deepest need, it can feel too intimate. We feel too vulnerable. It can be a little bit scary. I think that's what we see when Adam and Eve in the garden, when they eat from the fruit of the tree. And then it says in the cool of the evening, God was walking through the garden looking for them. They were hiding from God because it was too confronting for them to allow God to see what they knew, to sense that shame that they've been feeling. Now, remember how I said at the start of the sermon that this story takes place at the start of the Book of Glory. This section, really, the Book of Glory, marks the start of Jesus' journey towards the cross. And that means that in this story, in this dialogue between Jesus and Peter, there is a way bigger picture in play in this passage. In verse 4, John is playing with words, and he does this a lot in his gospel. He says that Jesus takes off his outer garment. The same word for takes off in the Greek is the word for giving up of his life. So John is actually foreshadowing the cross here. When he says that Jesus takes off his outer garment, he's using a word that says that Jesus is foreshadowing Jesus taking off his life on the cross. Right? So he's really messing with words. But what that means is that there are these higher stakes in play when Peter refuses to allow Jesus to wash his feet. When Jesus tells Peter that he has no part with him unless Jesus washes him, he's not just talking about dinner. What he means is that we can't have eternal life unless we accept Jesus making us clean through and through the cross. But I think I'd add it on a practical level. Unless we allow Christ to serve us on a daily basis, we're not going to be able to fully lean into wherever he's calling us to serve. Because we can only give away what we receive. I don't know if you've ever encountered people trying to tell you about God, and you can just see they've got no relationship. They don't know what they're talking about. Happens sometimes. We can only give what we receive. So this Lent, how are you receiving from the Lord? Have you got no-go areas in your soul? Areas where you're just afraid to let God in? How are you receiving through the Word? How are you receiving through prayer, whatever the Spirit has to give you? I don't think we can serve effectively without receiving Jesus' service. And Jesus' service, our relationship with Jesus is an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing thing where we are formed into his likeness. It's not a one and done thing. You know, I gave my life to Jesus 20 years ago and nothing's changed since. That's not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be an ongoing relationship. So I think picking up the towel means receiving whatever God gives us. Being willing to allow him to go and serve how he wants, not where we want. Something else we see in the story is that the towel requires action. Jesus tells his disciples after this that they are to serve in the same way that he has served them. He sums it up. Verse 14 and 15, he says, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." This parallels the broader new commandment that Jesus gives in verse 34. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. The two are connected. The washing of feet, the loving of one another. Jesus' example suggests that loving as he loves means taking the role of a servant, caring for the needs of others without expecting anything in return. And to do this, not only for those who treat us well, but even for those that disappoint us and hurt us and betray us. This command to love, though, it's not a command to feel affection for everyone, but a command to act in a loving way, even when we would rather do otherwise. And the thing is, we are always going to fall short of God's perfect love, but that's not an excuse to hang on to grudges or wallow in unloving behaviour. As we're washed by Jesus in God's deep and generous love, our hearts get stretched to love more completely, more fully, more unwaveringly. Now, I think one of the more interesting characters, who's a little bit enigmatic, in the New Testament is a guy called Epaphroditus. I can see you rolling your eyes. You already know him, but you don't think he's all that interesting, but just bear with me. Epaphroditus' story can be found in Philippians chapter 2. There's about 5 verses there that refer to him. That's verse 25 through 30. Epaphroditus was a guy who was a servant of the Philippian church, and he was sent to help Paul while Paul was in prison in Ephesus. Because back then, if you were in prison, you still needed someone to bring meals for you and stuff. The prison didn't provide those sorts of things. So Epaphroditus was there on behalf of the Philippian church to look after Paul while he was in prison. Sometime while he was looking after Paul, because these places were not sanitary in any way, shape or form, he became ill. And he became so ill he was on the point of death. Paul tells us that Epaphroditus the sickness Epaphroditus suffered came about because he was moving about the prison serving Paul's needs. And then he says in verse 30, Epaphroditus risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. The phrase there about risking his life is really interesting. Paul uses a gambling term there, which means to risk everything on the roll of the dice. Right? That was in other words, Epaphroditus willingly placed his life on the line to serve Paul. He bet everything on Jesus so that Paul would be cared for, and the Philippian church, which had sent him in the first place, would be well represented. Right? Now that's interesting enough and that's inspiring enough, but where it gets really interesting is around AD 250. There was a group of early Christians centered in and around ancient Carthage who started calling themselves the Gamblers. They named themselves after Epaphroditus and after this phrase in Philippians 2. And these people, the Gamblers, would go into the city of Carthage during the height of the plagues, when bodies were stacked head high along the streets. And they would pick the dead up and they would carry them outside the city and they would bury them. The Gamblers risked their very lives to serve the citizens of Carthage, many of whom hated them because they were Christians. That's the attitude of the people of the town. That's the attitude that Christ had when he got up and washed the disciples' feet. And that's the attitude that we're called to carry with us. But just like those gamblers 1800 years ago, or more, we don't have to do it alone. See, we're invited to be part of a community of town carriers. Because it's really hard to change the world just on your own. It's tiring. Jesus doesn't mean us to live on our own. We're meant to live in community. First, Jesus says, this is what I do for you. And then he says, this is what you must do for one another. It's a call to each other, to community. And the reality is, we only know how to love the world because we practice on each other. You guys can be prickly. You can be awkward at times. You do stuff I don't want you to do. But I get to practice and I get to love you, regardless what football team you're barrack for. Regardless of you not understanding what the telephone reference is. But that's okay. We find a way together. We practice loving each other. And that equips us to love the world around us. See, sometimes I think the church falls into the trap of we either sort of gather together and we get into a holy huddle and it's just us and there's no room for anyone else. Or we become so focused on the world out there that we're all focused out here and the church gets ignored. It's a both-and proposition, and one feeds the other. And as we learn to love each other, we actually equip ourselves to love the world. Jesus says that the world will know that we're his followers by our love for one another. And the way we demonstrate that love is by serving each other. See, picking up the towel is the way that we begin to live it and model love in our own lives and in our relationships and in our church and in our community. And I don't know, I wonder if you have got these experiences, but I've got countless personal experiences where someone else's service, their forgiveness, their love to me was absolutely Christ to me in that moment. I was thinking about it during the week, and towards the end of my time at Wyndham, before I had the burnout experience, I'd been working at Wyndham and hadn't been paid for 12 months because the finances were rubbish. We had a mortgage that we were trying to service, and we could pay the mortgage and we could pay the pastor, and we paid the mortgage. Now that was kind of okay because we were making ends meet, we were ahead on our mortgage and all that sort of stuff. But it was wearing and it was tiring. And I remember one day, probably 10 months in, we had friends just turn up on the doorstep one day and said, look, give us your 3 biggest bills and we'll just pay them. And it was such a load off. And it was Jesus providing for us in that moment. It gave Jesus a way into the room that he wouldn't have had otherwise. Have you ever had someone love you or serve you in a way that revealed God to you? That's the way of the towel. And it may not have been finances, it might have been something else. A ride when you needed it, a song when you needed it. I think for the church in the West, the day has come to stop asking, what can you do for me? And to start asking, where is the towel? Days come where we stop asking, how secure can you make me feel? And instead we ask, where's the basic? Who can I serve? I can't do everything, but I can do something. I love Mother Teresa's words, where she says, we can't all do great things, but we can do small things with great love. And you've got to know, I'm not here kicking you in the pants today. I'm not trying to lay a guilt trip on you, because I look around our church and I see countless examples of people serving, people who are embracing the way of the town. I think about our kids ministry leaders who invest weekly in the kids in our congregation. I think about our seniors who care for one another with great humility and affection and probably don't think of it as service, just as something to do. I think of busy people who take time out to help the homeless in the name of Jesus each winter. Or others who pick people up and bring them to services, who go out of their way to pick them up and bring them in. I want you to know, I see Christ when I see you serving. You need to know that. I suppose, as I finish up, I could ask you if you're a person of the towel, and for some of you you'd say yes, and for others of you you'd say no. But I suspect that true service is an outgrowth of genuine humility, just as it was for Jesus. See, just as the truly humble person has no idea they're humble, I suspect true servants don't see what they do as anything special. It's just something we do. True servant doesn't think about how they feel, or they look at a true servant will look at the needs around them and just do what needs to be done without being asked, without expectation of reward, without expectation of thanks, with nothing more at heart than a desire to love and act like Jesus. I think that's what defines people of the town. People who embrace a radical humility. People who are sure of who they are in Christ, which allows them to serve without agenda. People who give away what they receive. People of action. And people who do it in community. In a moment, Belinda and the team are going to come up and we're going to respond in worship. And I thought, maybe instead of just praying, as you sing, I want you to take the moment and seek God and ask, God, where's the towel? Whose feet can I wash? And to do the journey from there. Ready when you are.